Hi everyone, Anna Shell here from TutorCore, and now we're going to talk about the essay section of the SAT. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to go first start with a little bit of an overview of the essay portion of the SAT. So the first question that we want to ask before we even dive into any of the content is, does your student actually need to prep for this portion of the SAT? So really, you should only spend time on this section if the student really needs to take it. Most colleges and universities have agreed that the essay portion of the test is pretty useless for assessing college preparedness, so a lot of them have dropped the essay requirement. Today, fewer than 10% require it. So your student's time is precious, your time is precious. If they don't need to take it, they shouldn't before they register for the real test, because they'll need to decide whether or not to opt into the essay as part of their registration. They should check with the admissions departments of all the colleges and universities where they're applying and their requirements around the essay portion of the SAT. If none of them requirement, great, the student shouldn't bother taking it and prepping for it. If your student needs to take the essay, there's still a very strategic approach they can take in order to maximize their scores. So we'll go through that now. Students taking the essay can expect to be provided with a prompt along with a reading passage. They'll have a total of 50 minutes to read and analyze the passage and develop a written response. And in that written response, they'll be essentially explaining how the author of the passage develops their argument to persuade, and then support that explanation with evidence from the passage itself. The scoring of the SAT essay changed with the latest update to the test. So instead of receiving a single essay score, students now receive 3 scores, one for reading, one for writing, and one for analysis. Each of these are graded on a scale of 1 through 4, and there are 2 graders, so the total score will be the 2 scores combined, and each of those scores have a scale of 1 through 4. So for example, the student might get a 6 on reading, a 5 on writing, and a 7 on analysis for a score of 657. So now we're going to get into the rules for scoring well on this section of the SAT. The first rule is that the prompt is always the same. So the reading passage is always around 700 words, and then the prompt will ask how the author made their argument and ask a student to consider how the author uses evidence, reasoning, and stylistic and persuasive elements. So knowing this means that the student won't have to waste any time trying to figure out what they're supposed to do. They can just dive right in. The second rule is that the student will not be making an argument. Rather, the student will be discussing how the author made an argument. So therefore, the student shouldn't ever feel the need to insert an opinion into the essay, other than to say that the author did a good job. The author always, by default, made a good argument, and the student's only writing about how. The third rule is that the author's thesis is going to be literally written out in the box of text following the reading passage, so the student shouldn't waste any time trying to look for the thesis. Let's look at an example on the following slide. So here's what the text box will look like. The first sentence reads, "Write an essay in which you explain how Paul Bogart builds an argument to persuade his audience that natural darkness should be preserved." Right there, you can see the thesis spelled out. Natural darkness should be preserved. So the text box will always indicate the author's thesis. The student shouldn't waste any time trying to find it in the passage itself. The fourth rule is that the student should always indicate somewhere in the introductory paragraph that the author did a good job making their argument. The passages they provide will always include plenty of evidence, reasoning, stylistic, and persuasive elements, so the student should always indicate the author's argument is effective. The fifth rule to keep in mind is that the grading process is an assembly line. So these essays aren't graded the way an essay might be graded in an English class. The graders aren't usually reading very closely. Often they miss small spelling and grammatical mistakes, so students shouldn't worry too much about sweating the details, which leads to our next rule. Don't sweat the details. So even essays with perfect scores usually include some amount of sentence level errors. The student's main focus should be on the main organizational and content elements of the essay. If the student uses a big word wrong, it's not the end of the world. Generally, the longer the essay is, the more the College Board rewards the student. A long essay is about 600 to 700 words, which is approximately 2.5 to 3 pages handwritten. Most of this should be content, not quotes, which we'll get into later. With only 50 minutes, there won't be a lot of time to read and get out this much writing, so students will need to keep their eyes on the clock. Usually the best format for students to use is some version of the 5-paragraph essay, which will include an introduction, 3 to 5 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. It's boring and a little formulaic, but it works. The last rule is that students should use quotes from the passage, but not as padding to make their essays longer. So the best scoring essays are usually about 10% quotes, and the majority of the essays should be written by the student. Okay, I want to talk for a minute about the prompt. Every prompt asks students to consider 3 argumentative aspects of the passage. 1, evidence, 2, reasoning, 3, persuasive and stylistic elements. So let's break these down. First, an example. How does the author so the prompt says, as you read the passage below, consider how Paul Bogard uses evidence, such as facts or examples, to support his claims, reasoning to develop ideas, connect claims and evidence, and stylistic or persuasive elements, such as word choice or appeals to emotion to add power to the ideas expressed. So we're going to talk now about how each of these 3 aspects of the argument now. So first, let's discuss evidence. So evidence includes any statement the author uses to support his position. So this could include numbers or statistics, historical or political events, or anecdotes and personal accounts. Reasoning is the underlying logic that connects the evidence with the author's thesis. So the evidence answers the question of what, and the reasoning answers the question of how and why. The evidence is generally stated, whereas the reasoning, why the author chose the evidence and how it supports his thesis, is not usually directly stated. Finally, let's discuss stylistic and persuasive elements. This includes the author's usage of words or phrases to invoke specific emotions. So usually these are in the form of extreme words, anything with a synonym very, and any word that invokes specific feelings. So now that we've described the 3 aspects of argument your student will be asked to describe, you can start helping them pick these out of practice reading passages for practice. Structure and approach. So in this section of our training, we'll be talking about how to help your students structure and approach their essay strategically. So here's one recommended structure for your student's essay. So start with an intro paragraph. Be sure to mention here the author did a good job making their argument. Then spend about 1 to 3 body paragraphs discussing evidence and reasoning, and then 1 to 2 paragraphs discussing stylistic and persuasive elements. The student can wrap with a quick conclusion and repeat how the author did a good job developing an argument. Very formulaic. Students should approach the essay by first reading the text box below the passage to identify the author's thesis. So that's before they even get into the passage, first they should find the thesis. Knowing the thesis before attacking the passage will help the student pinpoint the evidence that connects directly to the thesis while they're reading through the passage. So next they'll read the passage, underlining the author's use of evidence, reasoning, or stylistic and persuasive elements. And then the student can decide on the main topics for the body paragraphs and then dive into the intro. The intro should, of course, include the acknowledgement of the author's thesis and should note they did a good job making their argument. It should also include the author's name and the title of the piece quoted in the passage. We don't necessarily recommend the students spend any extensive amount of time outlining. If they need to, they could sketch out a rough outline of the body paragraphs, but they shouldn't waste a lot of writing time on detailed outlining. Excuse me. Next, the student should work on the body paragraph. So start by citing 1 to 2 examples of evidence, show how these support the thesis. This can be repeated for the next paragraphs. Then the student can write the stylistic and persuasive elements paragraph. And finally, the student can wrap the essay with a conclusion, which can include a broad statement about how the author uses the elements noted in the body paragraphs to make an argument and restate the author's position that they did a good job. So there's the conclusion. So again, students should really avoid treating the essay as they might any other from school. They don't want to waste time taking extensive notes or writing extensive outlines. As long as they know the general formula, they should be able to spend the majority of that 50 minutes writing. It's helpful to check out the sample perfect or high scoring essays, which are available on the SAT College Board website. I'll go through a really quick summary of what these look like in the next few slides. So here's a link to the samples you can check out. An overview of one of them. One of them is 642 words, about 2.5 pages handwritten, 12% of that being quotes from a passage. It's 4 paragraphs, although it follows the basic 5-paragraph structure. So Here's the introduction from this essay. In response to our world's growing reliance on artificial light, writer Paul Bogart argues that natural darkness should be preserved in his article, Let There Be Dark. He effectively builds his argument by using a personal anecdote, allusions to art and history, and rhetorical questions. Note all of the elements we talked about. The students let us know the author's thesis statement, discuss this as effective argument using all the elements the student will address in the coming body paragraphs. In the second paragraph, cites statistics that the author uses, connecting them to his thesis, and then the third paragraph lists the author's appeals to emotion, using specific examples from the passage. You may note as you read through the sample that there are some small grammatical and spelling errors, and this is pretty typical of even perfect scoring essays. So overall, the essay on the SAT is extremely predictable, and students who are required to take it can pretty easily learn to crack the formula to get high scores in this section of the test. All right, so that wraps our SAT training video, which means we're totally done with content training, and our last two trainings address frequently asked questions and a little bit about follow-through. So thanks for your time and participation.